Welcome everyone. I'm very happy to see so many faces, so many daring people who want to really get into fear. So we have, well, let's see. Let's see what we can do about that subject. I really think it's daring to focus on it, and not because fear itself is often so frightening, but I think it's daring because it's so subtle. I really think it's an energy which is on a base level just everywhere. And every one of us, in any social situation, it's just omnipresent. You know, sometimes it's so subtle or so quiet in the back that we won't realize. Sometimes, depending on the circumstances, it's getting to the surface, quite obvious. But it's all the time there, really. So the tricky thing is that it is so subtle, that it is so deep in our nature, and that it can be so easily manipulated. And this is actually the subject. So I don't want to deal really with the psychological factors or the, how to deal in a psychological way with individual fear. I'm a psychologist, so that's one of those major problems that psychotherapists deal with, all kinds of phobia, ill fears. So, but I want to leave that behind for that workshop. I just want to focus on the fear which is really in any one of us, and which is so strong and such a powerful factor that it's really qualifying, changing our social organizations, our countries, and everything that is going on. I got, there are several ways how I got to that subject. So I want to give you an example how I got to it. Quite some years ago, I was sitting in the Mensa at the university. Do you call it Mensa? Yeah? You know, the big place where you have lunch. All the students have lunch. So I don't know how many of you had a chance to sit in such a large, was a huge place really. A lot of bright, young, intelligent people looking forward about the future of their lives, being engaged into very interesting subjects that they dealt with in their studies. But I was sitting there, and I was just a little bit listening to the talks that I got on the sides, and I recognized all that fear. What am I going in my life? What is it that I really will be able to do or to achieve in my life? Will I achieve to have a family? Will I achieve to have a good job, to have a good reputation? All these things which are, a little bit about ambition too, but there was a lot of fear really. Will I really have a chance to find a job? That university was a little bit to the border of, I'm from Germany, to the border of Germany, so that part there's not so much industry. So most of these students, they knew, well, if they ever would get a job, they would have to move anyway, just away from their families, from their friends, from... Anyway, the example is that I realized that kind of underlying fear. So I got very sensitive to it, and I listened more carefully in other circumstances. Once I've had an experience with, I'm working as a teacher for companies and governmental institutions, but also I was working for quite a few years for a trade union. So for those, I don't know whether trade union is the correct term. It's an organization where the labor movement is organized. So I was teaching seminars for them. And one late late night, I must say, I was in a talk with one of the representatives in a large company, a representative of the labor employees in a large company. And actually it took him quite many hours to really tell me that story, how much he was suffering and under pain really because of all these restructurings and all these, any development in his company always meant firing people. So when you are a representative of the labor force, you just have to carry that. You're in a sandwich position. On the one side, you would have to go for the interests of the employees and try to represent them. On the other side, you're very close also to the managers. So somehow you have to build a bridge. So, after these many hours, late at night, he just came up with his pain, and it was just so unbearable, even if as he told me, to stand that. And really the major factor was fear. The fear of the people. What am I going to do? So that was for me a very intense experience. And not because of his story, but because I couldn't help him. I was talking with him, I was just identifying with him, with his situation, but I recognized that this identification simply didn't help. Of course, he had a chance to talk about it, but it didn't give him real strength. It didn't give him some kind of distance, kind of relaxation, which he probably would have needed, so that he could continue this very, very difficult work. So that was some years ago, and since then I was thinking about that subject, fear. How is it really a factor in our social life? And what is it that we can really do in order to support people? And there are many factors really to it. One is someone who's like that labor representative. He was personally, he also felt that fear for himself, and he was in contact with that huge amount of fear of others. But there are different perspectives in society. Quite often I do seminars for leaders, and they usually have a good, they are the last to be fired, if ever. And also they, quite often, that's just a leadership role which brings another perspective to it, another logic. So you think about people and organizations in a very different way, and it's subtly, but definitely cutting off that kind of recognition of the people. What are, my decisions that I do as a leader, what does it really have an effect on them? So you have to somehow cut that out. And that's not only an emotional thing or a question of, individual liabilities, but it's really a different logic. So quite often I'm dealing with these leadership staff, and I just recognize how difficult it is to open them up for these problems that they are really causing a lot of fear in their employees. Because of course they think they do the best what they could according to their own sense of values and sense of ethics. So how to change that? Now, why dealing with that subject here in that conference? there's several aspects to it. One is, when you look at that problem of fear, you find out that it's quite an occult factor, really. So when you look into the Bailey books, you find that the problem of fear is very much tied up with the nature of the matter of our bodies, specifically our etheric bodies. So it's an inherent faculty of our etheric bodies and the specific kind of matter of it. So what does it really mean? That means that in fact this is an old karmic issue from the first solar system that we are carrying with us, which is still quite strong. And actually we are, in our societies, we have not yet really focused on that. We have not resolved anything of it. We just have managed to ever foster it and make it even increase. And this not only by ourselves, us, as human beings, but this also by the aid of the forces of materialism, because that's just a perfect tool in order to manipulate people. Being from Germany, having that, terrible history of the Third Reich, that was really a system of fear. And you can look in all countries where they've had some kind of totalitarian system, where the people were not free, but forced to think and do what the government believes was the best. That was all based on fear. So if people don't agree or don't fit into that model, they would have to be really afraid, because usually they got, imprisoned, they got tortured, pretty awful things happen. So that's just an outstanding example. But even nowadays, when, not many totalitarian countries are left, it's still a problem. It's quite easy for conservative parties to just play on that note of fear, just create a little bit fear to get overwhelmed by foreigners, by other races, just play on that racist card a little bit, or playing on the nationalist card a little bit. It's all arousing fear, and it works. So I think actually the conservative parties in our democratic countries, they're a little bit better in it, but if I'm really serious or if I'm really fair, I think the others are doing it also. And that's simply because no one really has recognized that problem. Usually the argument goes, of course the people have fear of some kind. Maybe they have fear for, Turkey becoming part of the EU or something. So of course we are it's utterly legitimate to play that on that fear and to manipulate it and use it, because it's not us, it's them. So I think it's a real issue. It's based on the karma of the first solar system, and it has been nurtured by humanity and its materialistic tendencies ever since. And I think it's a major issue that the Christ probably is dealing with or focused upon. And that's simply because just go into your own experience what fear really does to us. If you recognize fear, what does it really do to your mind, to your behavior? It's somehow closing everything, yes? So it's closing our perception, it's closing our tolerance, it's closing our empathy for others, it's closing a lot. In fact, I think it's really kind of prison. And the stronger fear really gets, it's, you know, it really breaks us off from our own dignity. But of course we wouldn't realize in that moment, because we're so much identified with fear that we just want to do something in order to get out of that. And that's what's making it so easy to have it manipulated. You know, because people are closing down their minds, and they would do what you tell them is the solution for the problem, which is always in the interests of those who would manipulate it. So I think it's really an issue that the hierarchy and the Christ specifically are dealing with. And so I think also we should better really deal with it. We should really care with it. And it's, you know, that issue of fear is not, you know, not up there in the spiritual heights of our aspirations. It's very, 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 very much on the ground. So if we want to help really in that work, we really have to care. We have to take care of it and dare to look into these very usual kinds of living, how people are living. You said this morning in your talk, when you go to Starbucks or at any place and are in contact with someone serving you, you know, then it's that same kind of, what is the relationship that you have in that moment? Is there anything that you strengthen, any kind of that fear pattern that you strengthen? So it's really all over the place. So we should take care. But of course the question is how. So how to take care of fear? Let me have some water in between. Yeah, Malia?
Is it not also built into the fact that this is the second solar system with a second ray, and fear is one of the glamours of the second ray? Built into us right from that angle as well?
Yes, that's true. And it's specifically related to the astral plane. It's, you know, the 9 heads of the Hydra. So fear is one of those heads, and it's related to the astral plane. That's true. But at least in the Tibetan's words, there is that sentence, that surprising sentence, that it is related to the kind of matter. So probably really the whole thing is going far behind or far back. And as we want to deal with it, I don't think, you know, liberating humanity from fear, I think we should really take care of that issue and start with it. I don't think that we will really liberate humanity from fear for quite a while. I think actually until the 4th initiation, fear is involved. So around the 1st degree, you know, the 1st initiation is related to the physical etherical plane, to the birth of the Christ principle on that lowest plane. So what kind of fear is involved specifically with that? You know, probably could make a long list, but I think the most essential one is probably to lose anything that you could have. The fear to lose anything that you think you have. But of course, if you have dealt with that conflict, that, you know, nice conflict which is around the 1st degree with Pluto and Vulcan involved, which causes some fear and some tension, of course you're not free from fear, because then you just do the next work, you focus on the astral plane, and still you are dealing with fear. So I think actually when you're on that astral plane, when you're heading for the second degree, you're probably heading for that huge glamour of fear. You know, that to blow that up. We all know these thought forms where we are really afraid of something. How might the future really go on? So when we're really afraid, that whole kind of big thought form. So around the second degree, that's the major thing, that that astral body is so strong, and it needs to be transformed. So you can get rid of that fear on that plane. Now, I don't think that at that point you are really free from fear if you have managed to control and to infuse the astral plane with the soul energy. Is there fear related to the third initiation? Yeah? What do you think?
Not at all.
Not at all. Well, I think there is. Actually, I think there's, you know, even Decay speaks about a fearful conflict leading up to the third degree. So I think it's some kind of fear to lose one's identity.
Or lose control.
Identity, you know, because it's the personality and the, you know, the dweller which is pretty strong, which is building on all three aspects of the dweller: the physical, the astral, and the mental, and opposing against the soul. So the true identity, of course, is the soul, but, you know, that's the fear. So even up to the fourth degree, I think there is some kind of fear.
When I say not at all,
Mhm.
what I meant actually
Yeah,
was that we are not controlled by fear.
yeah,
Although fear will be there until the fourth initiation.
yeah,
Because the fear is an issue of the emotional body. And the emotional body is controlled by the mind.
yeah.
But as we see in the label of Hercules,
Mhm.
with the Hydra,
Yes, I was speaking before, just, you have not been here in the room, so I just was speaking about it, and it's true. There's a huge measure of fear is dealt with until the second degree, and then it's just, you know, finished. But I think that whole fear issue is not fully resolved by the second degree. And even at the fourth, you have that, let me just finish that. So I think at the fourth degree, it's the fear to really lose all.
Father, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah. So, you know, I mean, normally we used to think about initiations in a rather individual way, but we really should think about it in terms of humanity. So humanity is now somehow in a process to undergo the first initiation. So there's some work to deal with fear to be done right now. But I think the problem will increase, really. It will increase until humanity will have covered the second degree. So it will accompany us for quite a while. Even in the middle of the fifth round at the Judgment Day, probably there will be a lot of fear. Of a different kind, probably, than now, but still there's fear. Yeah?
While we're speculating on
Mhm.
the fear about the third initiation, what do you suppose would be the fear inherent between the fourth and fifth initiation? If the third is mental and the fourth is why hast thou forsaken me, then what would the next one be?
Well, you know, it's hard to think that far. But I think that probably by the fourth degree that fear issue is over. Because what is really the fourth degree? It's that full resolution of that
Identity.
the whole matter aspect is resolved by the fourth degree. When you become an arhat, you need not to be in that wheel of life to incarnate anymore. If you want to, it's your own choice, and you have resolved that whole matter issue to a large degree. Of course not fully, because even the masters work on it. But so I think maybe it's over at that time. Yeah?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think it's all relative, because if we think of Saturn as having a lot to do with fear,
Yeah.
we know that Saturn rules the entire cosmic physical plane. So even the Christ and the Buddha, who are almost completing the seventh initiation, almost free of the cosmic physical plane, are experiencing a kind of fear which we can't have any comprehension of, because it is so much more subtle than the levels of fear that we're experiencing.
Well,
I think we have to assume there is some fear there.
well, could well be. I don't know.
That's right.
But what is for sure, that as the Christ is so much identified with humanity and with any little thing that is happening, of course he would be aware of that huge vampire of fear. So it's a question of what kind of experience of fear that it really is at that time. What I wanted to say is liberating humanity from fear is a long-term issue, but we really should start now. Now, in order to start, it's necessary to understand that whole thing a little bit better. And what I found very revealing, there are a lot of psychological books on fear and the roots or the origins of fear. But there's also a nice list in the Tibetan in White Magic. There's a nice chapter on fear. He's dealing with fear and depression, actually. So he says that fear really ties in with our instincts. So he gives 5 instincts and relates the major kinds of fear to these instincts. So one is the instinct for self-preservation. And the related fear is the fear of death. The next is the instinct of sex. And the related fear is the fear of separateness or isolation. Then there's a herd instinct. And the related fear is the fear of lacking safety or security. There's the instinct for self-assertion. And the related fear is the fear of being not recognized enough. And also the fear of failure. Failure would tie in with that instinct of self-assertion. And then there's an instinct to inquire, one of those outstanding qualities of us humans. And the related fear is the fear of the unknown. Of course, when we study fear, we could arrive at a much longer list. For example, fear of the future, fear of change, fear of, there's a lot. We just would have to look into our hearts and probably would find much. But it's interesting that it's tied up with these very, very basic instincts. And that's what makes fear really so strong.
Basically, Maslow's hierarchy.
Hmm?
Basically, Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah.
Food, shelter.
Yeah. So It's really a very, very basic factor. And that's why you reach really anyone on that if you want to manipulate fear. Now, when I started to think about fear as a social issue, I was struck by the fact that not only there's a negative side to it, but there's also a positive side to it. I was dealing with the negative side until now, but I think there's a positive side, or it appears to be, at the first glance, to be a positive side, and that's how do you really make it that human beings live together and find out that they live more or less in harmony with each other? It's a very basic how do you call that? There are some basic social dynamics, how human beings, like in a small crowd or small tribe actually, or in a small family, would interact in such a way that they live relatively harmonious with each other. I think the easiest thing is to let's just think about us a few thousands or even more years, back down in the Stone Ages, when there have been only small groups in a very, very threatening environment. So in order to survive in that threatening environment, it's necessary to cooperate the best with each other without using much words or many words. Yeah? I mean, if we are sitting here having a nice cup of tea at the fire, and over there comes a big bear or something, it's not the best thing to say, well, what are we going to do about it? Yeah? So you have to have immediately, you have to have the roles clear. Who's saying, okay, now you go there, you go there, you go there, you take this weapon, you take that. You would also have to have some kind of or norms or rules how you look at each other, because as a single human being you are extremely how do you say, vulnerable. Yes, vulnerable. So the only way to survive is to cooperate the best as you could. So therefore you would really need to know all these subtle factors in your face. You know, how do you call it? Mimic expressions in your face of your whole body in order to understand each other as quickly as possible. So how do human beings learn that? These subtle factors of interaction. You know, when we are going into, when we have been grown up in a certain culture, we know these factors. When we go to another culture, we oftentimes have that experience that we don't understand these others, and they don't understand me. So that's just a quite common experience. But the thing is that it is so, every one of us is so intelligent in learning these social interaction factors. And I think one major instrument in learning these is fear. That emotion of fear tells, you know, that is so quick, that when fear comes up, it's so quick, so fast, that it immediately tells us what is right or what is wrong. Should you do this? Should you do that? So I really think that fear has that kind of positive role in supporting us to learn just these modes or patterns of interaction. Seems to be a positive thing, really. Only with the downside that it can be manipulated so easily. But what is important, whenever we would start people to get rid of this fear, we would have the need to replace fear with something else, would make sure that the people really get along with each other. So organizations have made many experiments with changing the pattern how people interact in that organization. For example, in a team or really in a whole organization. So many experiments have been made to empower people, to take away some kind of leadership functions or leadership people, so that the people could organize themselves. You would give them the power and the freedom to do that. You would give them the power for decisions and anything. So quite often these experiments didn't turn out so positive or with so positive results. Of course, it's a nice thing to have more freedom, but sometimes people didn't want that, because they just realized, hey, I'm getting the same salary as before, but now I should do more work. Or they tried the best as they could. Germany is there are so many automobile companies, so they really tried that. And in the production lines for automobiles, you have that kind of mixture of cultures. There are not only Germans, there are Italian, there are Turkish, there are Spanish, there are all kinds of people there. So when you leave them free to organize themselves and you give them power, quite often there was a huge pressure developing in these groups, a pressure for homogeneity. So when someone was just not totally fitting, he was kicked out. Or at least, the psychological factors, how you would deal with him, how you would speak with him, and so would make it clear that, hey, come on, leave the game. So really, I think it's tricky to liberate humanity from fear. So for a long time, I was thinking about what is the real antidote to fear. What do you think? I'm not sure whether I really arrived at the right answer, but what do you think is the antidote to fear which could heal or overcome that kind of fear pattern? Robbie, what do you think?
And living trust.
Okay.
Trust in divine. Truly living it and believing it. And there's an exercise. If I'm getting in the car, I surround myself with light.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't fear a car accident. Can you teach people that?
Well, it's hard, actually, because trust is something which is built in very, very early. So if you don't have developed that so early, it's quite a work to develop it later. But I think really trust is a factor. Yeah?
But there are steps
Okay.
you can take to building interest.
Yes.
And one of them is skills. Like, for instance, your example of trusting in the car. If you know how to drive a car, if you've been taught to drive a car, it'll be easier for you to trust, because you have demonstrated to yourself and to others that you can stay on the road and maintain your car and arrive on time. So fear is greatly diminished if you have skills, and you can apply that to physical levels, emotional levels, and mental levels.
So you say trust is an issue, and you say specific skills. So in order to develop skills, you need a lot of mind, actually, because either you have skills which are related to just some kind of doing, yeah, or you have to learn more. And I think you need a lot of mind. But there are more, I don't know, maybe Dorothy first and then Steve, and then, okay.
This is related to getting data. Because oftentimes the fear comes because of the unknown, and we then create something and then we react to that. So getting the data and skills are one kind of subset of that.
So that's what you're doing is you are dividing the fear from the facts. There's some facts, but then there is a perception of these facts, and they are related to the fear. So that's an important one too, together with trust and mind and skills. That fear very, very much relates to our mind. With our mind we create fear. Yeah, so first Steve and then David and then, okay.
Using data to build hope. So that hope is not idealistic hope, but hope is active hope. Hope is concrete hope.
Yeah. Hope, yeah. You know, I was for a long time I was thinking hope really is the antidote, and I think it's an important one. The question of on what level is hope? You know, when you are speaking with someone who really has a real problem and is really dealing with fear, it's very hard to make him hope. It's very hard. So, in fact, when he's at that point that he could regain hope, he's already on his way out. So how could you really stimulate or put that hope in it? I don't know, but that's an important thing. David.
I was just going to use the general words that other people might have been thinking about. It's like a support mechanism. It's basically what you've learned from other people. And like for example, we're coming into this room now with all the summation of experiences from this previous moment, going all the way back in our life. So we have some experience in dealing with that energy and understanding about how to work with other people, or if you're all alone, you're in fear, you have to rely on whatever devices you have that you've learned from before.
Yeah. Okay, there are several. So maybe I think you've been first. Oh, okay. Sorry.
I was actually thinking that love would be an antidote, that lots of fears are not having enough love. If we have love, then we trust in ourselves, or we trust in the universe. If we have love, then we have hope. If we have love, we seek information. To me, and obviously that's a hard one to find, but to me that seems to be an antidote.
Yeah.
You know, in the words of John Lennon or the Beatles, love is the maybe.
Yeah.
It seems
Love,
to me working
yeah.
with people that's a more useful thing when people are really fearful, as you say, hope's really difficult to communicate to them.
Yeah.
But you can communicate love just with your interaction. It's okay to be frightened, you know you're frightened of failing or whatever it is. It seems an easier one to communicate, and particularly if you can hold that love for them and hold them steady in that love, I think. And it's
Okay.
like having the 1 minute eye interaction with the 7-Eleven boy. You know, suddenly there's that love that holds them steady in the moment, and their fear allows them to have a connection where they don't pull back until
Yeah.
that fear rises back up again, maybe.
Yeah. Actually, I was experimenting with that for quite a while. So I have a lot of Ray 6 in my system. And I find it easy to identify with someone, to have empathy, to have love. But quite often I found that this is not of help, because it depends on the level. You see? I think it's not that emotional type of love which is required, but it's another type of which gives that kind of anchoring, that kind of strength, that kind of trust, actually, you know? Which gives the other one that feeling that, okay, there seems to be something where I can hold on. because really fear makes us lose the ground so often. So that's just, so it's love, but from another level. Okay.
I think that as the first personally, the first step to be taken, especially with working with individuals, is the acceptance. Just the normalizing that that's a phenomenon that's happening. I think the fight of fear is just as much agonizing than fear itself. And then you build a trust, you build a compassion. But if the person is rejecting, so it's not to be compliant with the fear, but it's to actually recognize it, normalize it, and not be in that push for it. Not be taken over, but accepting, normalizing that it's part of the human experience. Enlarging that.
Yeah. I think that's a very important point too, because actually when we just look what we are doing usually with our kinds of fears, that's exactly or precisely what we do. You know, if the fear is, you know, just small or not that intense, we just put it away, and after a while, may that be minutes, hours, or days, it grows in strength, and at some point then it just floods into the room and into our minds. That's what it happens. So that the technique to push it away is quite usual, but it doesn't really work. And that, I think that same dynamic is not only true for us individually, but also in the social field. You know, when I was working with these labor representatives, that's just an overwhelming experience, fear. But usually they don't talk about it. Or if they do, they have no idea how to deal with it, how to stand it, and how to regain dignity and the ability to engage with full strength again. So now there have been several. I don't know. I don't know who was first. Yeah.
My thought, I was very intrigued when you said, and I'm going to have to go look it up, about the nature. I think you said DK's talked about the nature of it's held in the nature of the etheric bodies and matter. And that brings me, I do body work and work with the etheric, and so it seems to me that particularly as we talked about, if it's early on in the development, when the physical etheric is becoming coordinated, where fear is instilled, trust can be abrogated, that the etheric field might be a very direct way to work with it. And I think that of martial arts, and where you work directly with the field, directly with the breath, which is the will, and in that way reestablish the field, reestablish the connection and the coordination. And that vehicle over which we can have some control, and also becomes the astral etheric interface.
Yes, I think if you work with an individual, to start with the body could be a useful or could be a good way to start with it, because in fact that fear, you know, just when we just recognize how does fear really work within ourselves, it's in the body. Whenever it starts, it's really some kind of bodily experience. We even could recognize it in the way how we stand, the way how we have our head. So if that is an issue which really accompanies us for a longer time in our lives, it's in the body. So body work really could help for individuals. The interesting thing is that it's also in the body or in these substantial things in social organizations. It's the way how these the purpose of a certain group or organization is set up, what is dealt with, the functions, and how it is related to others. You could find it also in that kind of material things in the social field. Now, but how many? And Uta too?
Somewhere, DK also says exactly what you just said. He's talking about glamour and how to deal with glamour, which is inside your brain. And he says exactly that term. deal with physical etheric, and only when the physical etheric has been dealt with, then address it on the emotional level. So I'm not sure how it fits into the body. I was thinking of it more in a different sense of setting up a physical etheric environment. But maybe you're right in that somehow there is a link into the physical body and healing.
Yeah, I think the link is between what Lawson said before and what you said. So you have that in the body, that experience in the body, or you have the skills and what you really do. So whenever you want to change a social group and make them rid of fear, you have to change their patterns of behavior, their patterns of thinking, their documents, their... Okay, so Gail.
I was going to say the culture of fear
Yes.
has got to be addressed. We are so impacted by the culture of fear that we have created. And I was a business consultant for many, many years, and I would be hired to go into companies, and the mandate was drive out fear. Okay, you ask people, what are you afraid of? Well, we can't talk as long as he's in here. So we gave you a small list, and then we get these long lists of fears. But the culture was such that if they surfaced, you'd have your head cut off. So I think that kind of culture has re-emerged significantly, and even if on an individual level you have freed yourself, if in the workplace or the social setting you are impacted continually by obstacles, it's very different. Because we're cultural beings, we don't live in isolation.
Yeah, precisely. Now, I think Uta was... yeah.
I think a key factor is to, whenever there is fear and we recognize that there is fear, is to make the effort to see the wider picture. Because the fear, because it is contracting us, it makes us identify and over-identify with some aspect. And we can't find the solution on that level where the fear is. So we have to open up and see the situation that causes us the fear, to see it in a larger perspective. And when we come to a recognition that this too shall pass, it's temporary. All fear is temporary. When we can link in with this temporariness, then this factor of hope is present. And we see, okay, this is right now the case, but it will not stay forever. And also then we can see what is the lesson here. Then we can see, okay, this is actually something that I have to learn. I can use this situation not to react with fear, but to be active. What is my lesson? And that empowers me, and I grow by that.
Yeah. So that pretty much ties in what Dorothy has said before, to somehow discriminate between that feeling of fear and another perception, which again involves a lot of mind. See it from another perspective. See that, well, there's this fear, okay, but this is the situation, even if it's very difficult and very much, with no good alternatives, I might get a little bit more freedom to really act and engage. Okay, so several more. I don't know who is first, maybe you?
Well, I have a question. We're discussing this on the level of people that are taking responsibility for their own paths. When you consider the number of people in humanity at this point that purposefully subjugate themselves to either exterior political and or social, religious power, and in those systems the tool of fear is being implemented, how do you help those people escape from fear when they don't even know that they shouldn't?
Yeah.
And I mean, that's my question. How do you address that? Because those tools are then bleed over to those of us that know better, but finding a way to get through those traps that are set is, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And how do we help the other people that are already allowing themselves?
Yeah, I think I fully agree. That's a pretty tricky thing. That's really my usual experience when I'm working with leaders from an upper level in companies or organizations, because they are trapped in that pattern, but they don't know, and they feel strong, so they wouldn't let you tell them. And the same thing is true with in the political field. Whenever you are, those doing the groundwork, that's more easy, because they are just very much touched by all these kinds of emotions. But the higher you get, the more difficult it gets, really. So, well, how to reach through to these people? Either there is some kind of suffering, so that they would come, or you would have to start from a very different point. And maybe they would get there. Maybe. You would have to, for example, you would, you would teach them some skills of some kind, but together with that skills, you teach them just some basics of interaction, which we would term something like compassion, empathy, or love, the terms, but you would teach them some basic skills. And maybe if that works very well, and if you touch their hearts, then you could get there and change a whole pattern. But maybe, otherwise, that's how life really is. Quite often we cannot do much. We can just try to embody a different pattern for ourselves and radiate that. And maybe just others hook to that and ask, but if we would do something else, it would be an attack on the free will. The other thing is to work politically. That's something else. It could change patterns too, but that's quite often not changing the pattern really. You can stand up for a different political perspective, but quite often you cannot change these patterns, these emotional patterns. Now there are so many. I don't know. Okay. Yes.
My understanding is, well, if somebody comes to us and asks for the help, it's different than if we just see it.
Yeah.
My understanding is if it's a client and we understand it's a physical problem, we work from the emotion, we work on emotional. If it's emotional, we work on the mental, and mental, we work on the spiritual. And knowing the race structure of that person, or getting a sense that we work according to if they're first-rate personality or soul, second, third, and then we work according. So if it's more of a mental problem, we give affirmations. If it's more of a second-rate heart, we might do visualization. And so we recognize the person, and then in that recognition, often they will be witnessed and move into what they need to be doing with that understanding.
But what you are doing, if you do that, what kind of strategy is that? You are trying to change the perception. You see, before we said there's a fact, but then there's a perception of that fact which really creates the fear. That recognition, that kind of cognitive activity which really creates that. So if you would give people that kind of help, you would actually try to change these thought forms and patterns that the person would have in the mind. A similar thing you could do with groups, depending on what they really stand. So if they're really dealing with tough issues, they would jump into your face if you just say, you have to use some affirmations. Yeah? But yes, that's just what I say. I don't want to make us lose the very terrible situation, that we would lose this terrible situation out of our viewpoint. It's rather easy if there are people, like us, who have fear on a very subtle level, just a little bit, to deal with that. It's also easy to deal with groups or organizations if they deal with that pattern just on a very, very, moderate level. But there where the problems really are that's when these strategies have to work too. So we would have to, I think the strategy is just excellent, yeah? So but we would have to find the right words which fit for them in this situation. There have been many more, Gail?
Well, it seems in organizations or larger groups, you have to start with the leader. If the leader doesn't display value in not having a peaceful or a non-fearful organization, one where peace and trust reside, if the leader who wields tremendous power does not lead that kind of effort, everybody's looking up to see what the guy above him is going to do. I don't think it would be effective. I think it's a question of leadership as well as people at the grassroots tuning into that. I'm not talking just political, but I'm talking about companies, Ford Motor Company, whatever company, large corporations. The leader sets the tone.
Yes, it's true. Leaders have a huge influence. On the other hand, I also see that it's quite often, very often, that those who are not the leaders take precisely that as an excuse to do nothing. You know, what should we do if we do that in the political realm? We just blame our governments for something. What do we really do? And the same in organizations or in groups. So I think one important issue really with that fear is to make the individual ready to take a responsible part in that whole. And actually I've seen many examples of people who have not had a leadership role which had a major beneficial effect on their team or on their whole unit. And it's really, even if we think that through, if we go through all our life experiences, I'm sure that anyone would have at least one good example for that.
Well, there's the critical mass theory too, that if you have enough people within the organization that create like-mindedness, a significant change can occur.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, now we're still in that phase of gathering antidotes for fear.
Right.
Yeah? So, okay. Who was first? Maybe you.
Well, I was thinking, and I think Sherry brought this up, and someone else did too. I mean, when DK talks about it, he gives us the prescription in Glamour, which is the technique of the technique of light and the technique of indifference. And really, what Sherry was talking about was kind of looking at everything from that higher perspective, and someone else here mentioned that too. In each case, you need to bring in the soul. You need to apply a higher perspective to the issue or the problem in order to address it holistically. And to me, that's the antidote in any situation, whether it's group or individual, is that they need to move up one level and look at their issue, their problem, their fear from a slightly higher perspective.
So the question.
That's the job of the facilitator, is to help them to see that higher perspective, or to move on to that group. Either is it a brotherhood? Is it looking at this in a group way as opposed to an individual way? Looking at it in an organizational way. I mean, I'm just putting this out as taking DK's very esoteric approach, which are these techniques, and trying to apply them in a more practical world setting, dealing with real people.
Well, actually, most of the psychological techniques to deal with fear are based on using the mind, which is just a higher level from the emotional. So you would, I mean, there are several techniques actually, but at some point at least, it always would involve a clear perception of the facts and a clear analysis of the facts and what you can do, and a kind of discrimination between the facts and the perception, or my way of looking at that, which really creates or reinforces or even increases the fear. So that's one way to deal with it. Now it depends on what kind of fear it is really all about. There's sometimes also the soul level needed. Okay, but I think before that was Gail, and then... Yeah?
Okay.
Robbie.
I want to further explain when I said trust, and a lot of things that I've studied over my life, this isn't from UK, but it's the concept of fear, and that if you fear something, you put an energy to it and you attract it to yourself. There's an energy exchange when you fear something. And so this teaching, and I've actually practiced this for many years, and it involves a skill, but it's a mental skill, is when I get in the car, yes, I know how to drive the car, but what I don't know is if somebody's going to flip out in front of me. And so I make the conscious choice, I don't need this. I do not need a car accident today, and my higher self is just going to take care of it. And if that guy was going to pull in front of me, my higher self's going to tell that one's higher self, stop. And so it's a matter of, it's a practice, it's a skill, but it's making a choice. And also what I would say about addressing the masses, if we can learn to do this, then it just radiates out. And you talk to some guy in the grocery store who's kind of dull, maybe, and if you want to put it that way, but you say something to him, or he watches you do something that he didn't know was possible. And you because your trust is in your higher self, and you believe it, and you consciously act on it every day. But first you have to recognize the fear. And that's the really hardest part, is that you wake up every morning with this whole myriad of fears going on in your head. That's one of the skills.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to.
Well, you all know this esoteric sentence, energy follows thought. So this is what we're dealing with now. You know, what you have said, what many others have said. So to not reinforce it. So if we will really deal with someone else, an individual or a group, we would have to be very careful that we not, with our kind of listening, our kind of response, also add to that fear problem, but actually really take it, make it lessen. So that's quite tricky actually, because our usual behavior within groups or within other individuals would of course be that kind of compassionate attitude. We would listen, we would talk about it, we would share in that experience, in that evaluation of the facts of the situation, in that perception, and thereby we would actually foster or strengthen fear.
I don't know, I'm thinking the antidote to humanity. You started out as talking, for humanity as a whole. And I don't know exactly how this is an antidote, but the idea of interconnectedness and the awareness of one humanity. And I think of like the incidents of the Hurricane Katrina or September 11th, where there's a common experience that a large group of people go through together. And that they have the same experience, and they may deal with it differently, and they may have very many levels of fear, but they're together. It's one group. This, I think, relates to the issue of our involvement as a whole in the planetary etheric as a whole. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. Okay.
So mine is similar to yours, and you talked about when there was a hurricane or a tsunami or anything. I think what needs to happen is people need to be identified with something other than themselves. So when we identify with suffering or with other people in need, it helps us to not identify so much with what's going on in our own system, and we don't give energy so much to our own system. When we're helping other people, we forget about who we are. And I also think in something about helping other people, there's something about love. And I don't know how it works, but I think that somehow just deals.
Yeah. Well, I think it works. We covered that, or we dealt with that before already. I think the question is the level. So, from my life experience, and probably you have similar experiences, there are moments when I really, when it's easy to get into that soul contact and work from that level. But then there are other moments, and especially those would be the real opportunities, the real challenges, when it's very hard, Like the one example that I told before, when I was talking to that labor representative late night. I was just tired. So what I did, I was listening, but I didn't really help him. Now, what are we doing here with that discussion? Searching for antidotes. By the way, I have two more, which might be interesting too. One is something like courage. So I don't think that courage resolves the situation, because it doesn't, if you have no ground, it's very hard to get courage. But it's involved. And another one is creativity, because usually fear closes down our whole mind, and what it really cuts away is all our creativity. Normally we would have that broader perspective in our mind, but the fear cuts away our thinking capability and that creative thinking. Well, what is it really that we're dealing with? What kind of other solutions could I search for or go for? So creativity is an important thing, and actually there's an author dealing with that factor of creativity as an antidote to fear. He's actually a science for economy, economist. Anyway, but these are factors too. Now, what is it that we have done now in this kind of gathering? What is an antidote to fear? I think we've done something very important, and this is also a technique that could or should be used in dealing with fear when we're working with individuals or groups, to have some kind of dialogue, which is getting very, very silent in a way, that underlying silence, and to really listen. Because I think a very important antidote to fear is, what is the specific need? The need which is involved at that very moment or in that situation. And how to get to these needs. Usually when you start talking with people, you wouldn't talk about needs. You would talk about convictions, you would talk about opinions, you would talk about interests and wants, and all kinds of. And usually you wouldn't even really listen, but you would argue whether this kind of opinion is right or wrong. So an important thing is to get some, one step below, not in sense of, more to matter, but below in the sense of a step deeper to those people, to find out what is really their need at that moment. And that's probably what you do too when you are what you said before, when you give an affirmation to someone, you would have to be very discriminate. I mean, it's not a solution to listen just quickly and say, what you have to do, this. We all know these experiences when we consult a medical doctor, and he's just, he has a minute. Maybe you have these experiences. So he doesn't even look at you, he just stares into his thing. Okay, take that pill and move away. So this is not a solution, because it really goes deeper. And so we have to get to these needs, and actually I think we have to get to the point where the person or the groups find for themselves a solution, something which is giving them a hold, a strength, an idea to resolve the situation or to engage in another way. So what you really can do all the time is to facilitate that kind of process, and at the same time to hold that. I think that's sometimes that can be extremely difficult. to hold these intense emotions which come up while not getting affected by them, to be compassionate. Well, but you know, because when you're doing that, you're actually facilitating, or you're quickening the process for them. Because these emotions, they are just there. They need to get somewhere. You couldn't get anywhere if you don't let them in, invite them to come up. Okay. Yeah,
I
Leah?
would suggest that everyone present here who's been sort of thinking in terms of the multiple levels of fear might find the webpage www.emofree.com very helpful, because it describes a technique that works at the physical, etheric, emotional, and mental levels simultaneously. It's very easy to learn, it's cheap, and it's quick, and is very good at dispelling your stuff, on whatever level it is.
Yeah.
This isn't the time to go into any detail about it, but there's a free manual you can download off the webpage that is very effective.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think fear is such a common problem. There's a huge amount of literature and help concerning the just conventional psychological level, how to deal with it. But the more tricky, the more tricky is that social dimension of fear, which is not a clinical matter really. You know, fear of the future, fear of failure. If you're just doing your job and you're not really failing, but still you're struggling with that fear. So these kinds of fear, or also these others that I've talked with before, which could be so easily manipulated. And for those, almost no literature really exists. It's just recently that I found that sociologists start to think about it, and they call it culture of fear or politics of fear. Yeah? So there's...
Criminologists work with that.
Yeah. So there's something starting, but it's a very early phase. Yeah, Dorothy?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention I know for myself, I think about the political environment, for example, a lot of the political environment here in the United States, and the way in which fear is used to manipulate and control. And then I find myself getting fearful of the fear dynamic, which means that then I myself am giving energy to that. So I think it's important for us to be able to think about fear and work on fear without putting fear energy.
Yeah, and I think when the more we get into problems of that kind, it's not only the mind which is necessary, but it's the Tibetan says it's in the last analysis. It's the more the mind is a part of the problem, the more mind is involved, and that is the case in these social or political realms. The more mind is involved, the more you need really the power of the soul. And the interesting thing is, it's not the power, but it's the wisdom. It's not the love, it's not the power, it's the wisdom of the soul. So it's again that question of looking at the situation from a broader perspective, understanding it, finding another way to deal with it. It's, so it's not, in essence, it's not courage, it's not strength. I find that very interesting. Okay.
The bottom line is meditate.
Yes. If you work with people who are trained to, or you could lead them. You told me at lunchtime, you told me there's some, tricky methods to teach people how to meditate. If they are not used to, and if you would use that word meditation, they would just, so, there's some visualization exercises, or you could even do it in a, in a dialogue. You could lead just a dialogue and get everyone calm down and think differently, inwardly. So you can do a lot of things without calling it meditation. Well, actually, it's a broad subject. So I'm looking at the watch. It's almost close to 5. But it's really that we have to gather together a lot of these antidotes. Courage, creativity, love. What else have we covered? The mind, the wisdom of the soul.
Healing techniques.
Yeah, working with the body, or looking very closely at the documents of the group on the way how they the processes. I don't know how to call that in English. In cooperation, what you often do, you look carefully at all the processes. You have an organization, you know, it's with an organigram, but then you have the people working in daily lives. So you have all kind of working processes for individuals, for groups. Not only group dynamics, but it's also a question of, you know, what kind of unit of the maybe cooperation, and how they would cooperate with another unit. For example, the selling unit and the, you know, personnel office unit, whatever, you know. So all these kinds of processes that you have to look very carefully and see whether there is not some moment which actually strengthens or increases the fear. And probably the most important thing is to overcome our own fears, because otherwise we have no chance. So I just know, you know, I do have a lot of fear. And you know, well, anyway, that would be a long story, but most likely any one of us has fears. So as long as we are ourselves trapped into these patterns, we cannot really help others. Especially, and that's, you know, if it's Sunday, if we meditate, that's an easy thing. You know, on these nice sunny days when we feel good, it's very easy to be free from fear. But in those moments when it really counts, it's more difficult. So what I found very useful is to learn from myself, which is somehow a strange phrase, really. Let me explain that. There are events in life. You know, I'm dealing with someone or a group, and they might have a problem which involves that kind of fear problem that we've dealt with now. So there are moments when I'm just full of strength, full of, you know, full of energy, just full of confidence. Everything is fine. I've just a good day. And quite often, even if the problem is quite difficult, I would find somehow a way how to deal with it, how to deal with these people. But usually I wouldn't recognize, because the general topic of the talk would be something very different, not about fear. So I wouldn't recognize what am I doing in these moments when I'm really doing good, when I'm useful. The only thing I recognize is those moments when I'm not doing so good, because these are negative emotions and they just keep to our memories and okay. So really, that's what I think. That's one of the very, very important tools to learn from ourselves. What is it that I'm doing in those better moments? How am I useful then? Thank you. Sorry, what?
Have you seen those T-shirts that
No.
say "No fear"? Fear, fear, fear.